G'day guys, E53 here, and if you've read the title, you'll know that we are looking at the first race of the Formula 1 season, which happened over the weekend, the Australian Grand Prix. And this is a point where I'm just going to momentarily get out my smug face. Because I did say, after testing, everyone was saying that Ferrari was the top team, that they were the fastest, they were going to come to Albert Park and clean up. And if you watched my video a couple of videos ago just about the preview of the season, I think it was called F1 testing, every team ranked after testing or something like that, I said at the time that the Mercedes were going to be on the front row in Melbourne and probably win the race as well. That's exactly what happened. So I'm going to take that because it's not too often you get things like that. So I'm going to get out my smug face for just that one. But one thing that I was definitely wrong about, and I think a lot of people definitely would have been wrong about, is thinking that of the two Mercedes, Lewis Hamilton was going to be the fastest. It didn't turn out to be that way. Valtteri Bottas destroyed him. There's just no other way of putting it. Absolutely destroyed him, and there's a lot of talk around the place that Lewis was driving a lot of the time with a broken floor, but we can't figure out how it happened because he never went off the track and everything. And I'm just sort of wondering, and this is sort of a long shot, but I'm almost reminded of the time when Red Bull actually told Vettel that there was a crack in his chassis or something like that when there wasn't, because he'd been beaten by Webber and it was driving him crazy, and so just to put his mind at rest, they actually told him that there was a crack in the chassis when there wasn't. That's probably not the case here, but it is something to think about. I mean, Hamilton didn't really run off the track at any stage during the weekend, so how did the floor break? I'm not sure. But in any event, Bottas creamed him, disappeared up the road, could have won the race by 30 seconds. If he hadn't sort of backed off and brought it back, and I think the margin was something like 23 at the line. So what a difference a beard makes. Where has this come from? I mean, I never thought I'd say that Diet Vanilla Coke Valtteri Bottas was the hardest nut on the grid, with all his, crossing the line, FU, all the rest of it. Like, where has this actually come from? He was the biggest rough nut on the grid that included Jos Verstappen's son, and a guy who shares a name with both Lando Calrissian and Chuck Norris. Where did this come from? But in any event, it seems to be working for him, and I'm sort of reminded for any Aussies listening is just about, if you remember the Ashes series of a few years ago when Mitchell Johnson, who'd been over to England in the Ashes series over there, got absolutely belted all over the place, and then he came back out in Australia with a beard and cleaned up. So it's obviously in the beard. I'm fairly sure when Lando Norris goes out and he's actually able to grow a beard, he may even fall into the same sort of category. So first off, Mercedes, very quick. Valtteri Bottas, if he can keep up that kind of attitude and that kind of form for the remainder of the season, we could be up for a repeat of Hamilton v Rosberg. And I wonder if Hamilton will be saying then, as he did when Bottas first joined, that Bottas is the best teammate he's ever had. I'm wondering if that'll continue on if they're fighting for the title. But either way, credit to him. He's gone out there. He said, look, I've only got one career. I'm not going to spend the time being the nice guy. I want to go out there. I want to win things for myself. He went out and did that and even took the fastest lap point into the bargain. So awesome job for him. And I guess the flip side of that particular story is Ferrari. And no one really expected them to be so far off the pace. I certainly didn't. In qualifying, it was around about the same sort of gap as it was at the start of last year, about 0.8 of a second or something like that, which is pretty big. But for it to continue on into the race, that gap not really narrow a whole lot, was really strange. And I don't know if we really expected too much of Leclerc too soon. But, I mean, he could have beaten Vettel, but Vettel was strangely off the boil. And in the end, they had to use team orders to keep him behind, which he didn't seem too upset about, as you wouldn't really be in your first race with Ferrari. But I think people expected a bigger fight out of Ferrari, all in all, which I certainly did. So hopefully, just for the sake of the season, I mean, I'm not overly given to supporting Ferrari, but for the sake of the season, hopefully they're able to pick it up in Bahrain, and Melbourne's just, as we all know, Melbourne's a bit of a quirky race. So hopefully Bahrain suits them a little bit more and they're able to make a bit more of a race of it. I don't necessarily want to watch another race of Mercedes driving around, or another season of Mercedes driving around out the front on their own. I'm not sure about you guys, but it doesn't sound that interesting to me, so I'd like to see a couple of teams get up there and challenge them. And of course that brings us to the other team, which I think in my rankings I put a tentative third, which is Red Bull, sort of depending on the way that the Honda engine was going to work out. And to be honest, early signs are pretty good. There was talk around the testing of them having vibration issues and other bits and pieces and stuff like that. And I think even Red Bull were a little bit doubtful as to where they actually were. But in the end, it was okay. Well, even for Verstappen's car was all right. Gasly was pretty awful. Started badly. Obviously, the qualifying strategy had a bit to do with that, and he never was really able to make his way through. But that being said, no one ever does in Melbourne, so, give him a bit of time. But Verstappen was right on it. A lot was made of the fact that Verstappen was able to pass a Ferrari down the straight with that move he put on Vettel. Yes, he passed him down the straight, but he also had the benefit of accelerating through a fairly fast corner, which, as we all know, is Red Bull territory on the lead up to that pass. And he also had the world's biggest DRS assistance as well. Those DRS slots are so much bigger this year. So a couple of things in there as well, but it's certainly not a GP2 engine anymore. So that's only good for those guys. And if Gasly's able to sort of get up there as well, then that's going to be good for him. If he can't start matching Max, then what does Red Bull do? Do they put Kvyat back in the car? Oh, I really don't know what the solution is. Maybe they have to bring in someone from the outside. If they're not willing to promote either of the Toro Rosso guys, but early days, so we'll see how Gasly gets on. So going on from that, of course, the other story I think that most Aussies were following was Dan Ricciardo, how he's going to go with his new team. It wasn't really convincing. There was a lot of expectation, I suppose, that he was going to come in and drag that team to a new level immediately, which of course is not realistic, but we all really wanted to see how the performance of that car had come along. It really does appear as though they're pretty much in exactly the same spot as they were last year, as are most of the teams actually. But Renault, where everyone sort of thought that they may have taken a step forward, they really haven't. They're about where they were before. And Ricciardo did say during the course of the weekend that it was just taking a little bit of time to get himself into their methodology and their way of working. And I think there was only one practice session in which he was quicker than Hülkenberg. They were very, very close all the time, but Hülkenberg shaded him each time, also did it in qualifying. And of course there was that mistake that Ricciardo made off the line, ripping the front wing off, and that was all there is to it. I guess it's unusual for tracks to have areas on the grass on the start-finish straight that you can't put a wheel onto, but you'd think that the team, Daniel, somebody would have noticed that in the track walk, that they would have done when they first arrived on the weekend, that you can't actually do that. So unfortunately that was the end of a lot of the interest for the home crowd after all that hype and build-up. But once again, it's a long season and we'll see how those guys get on. And Hülkenberg, of course, is going to do his reputation no harm at all if he's able to keep up with Ricciardo and put in that kind of performance in comparison to him, because realistically he beat him all weekend. So it's really good for Nico. He's always been highly rated, and I guess we're seeing now how good he is.
Shut the fuck up.
Other takeaways from the weekend, I think Lando Norris, everyone was impressed with his qualifying, weren't they? Carlos Sainz was saying, if XYZ didn't happen, I could have been in Q3 as well. I don't know. I mean, they all say that. They would say that, wouldn't they? But I think that Lando's effort in qualifying in his first race, 19 years old, was pretty outstanding. That was pretty crazy to get right up there in P8. He drifted back throughout the race and was super critical of himself afterwards. I don't think he's got too much to be ashamed of. I think that lap was a little bit unrepresentative of where McLaren are at the moment, and it was really, really quite a well-timed and well-executed lap. And I think he probably can't be that disappointed with falling back a little bit during the race. If he hadn't been held up behind Giovinazzi, he may have been able to finish a little bit better. But once again, it's one of those things we can only guess at. Haas was a lot better than I expected them to be. I think I put them quite a long way down in my pre-season testing wrap-up. And I really did think that being third in the pecking order of that Ferrari, Alfa Romeo, and then, of course, Haas in that sort of pecking order would hurt them. And I still think in the long run it's going to hurt them. I don't think they're going to stay where they are now for the remainder of the season. I think we're going to see them fall a little bit backwards, but they're a lot faster than I expected them to be in Melbourne. And it was very similar showing to what they did last year, actually. And once again, of course, Grosjean's left front falls off. But thankfully for them, Kevin Magnussen able to make it to the end and score some points, and these are points that they really deserved last year. So it was good to see them get up there and get a little bit of redemption at least. It would have been terrible to see both of them retire with pit stop issues again, that's for sure. And I guess really the only other notable takeaway from the weekend was Williams. And it's sad to say, but I don't think that anyone expected them. Everyone sort of knew they were last. No one expected them to be that far last. They were so far away. They were able to take advantage a little bit of the Mercedes engine's qualifying performance to only qualify about a second behind 18th place, but they were so far away, and it's just such a big shame. And I hope that they can do some work to actually catch up. And by the end of the season, that's not so big, but they're operating on quite a limited budget as well. So whether they actually have the ability to do that or not. George Russell seemed pretty solid. He outperformed Robert most of the weekend. Didn't make any of the little mistakes that Kubica made. But once again, we'll see how that sort of develops over the course of the season. But good signs for at least the way that George Russell can put together a Grand Prix weekend. So positive signs for him very early on, as all of this is, but a positive start for him at the very least. And nothing else really stuck out about that race. I would have expected probably a little bit more from Kimi. I would have thought he would have, just looking at his practice times where he was sort of up there in the top 6, he was kind of anonymous in the race, which was a bit disappointing. But in any event, I think we've actually got to start this season almost an identical sort of pecking order as we had last season. Just a few of the gaps are a little bit different, but we'll see what happens when we get to Bahrain anyway. It's a completely different track, completely different layout. Ricciardo seems to be saying that he's got to be able to focus a lot more and actually hopefully put together a better weekend for himself. And then, of course, there's also the battle at the front, which is it's going to be interesting to see how it ebbs and flows over the season. Ferrari have always been pretty strong at Bahrain in the hot conditions, and there's a school of thought to think that Renault may be quite gentle on its tyres too, which would be quite handy for the heat. But I guess all eyes are going to be on badass Bottas and the beard to see if he's able to carry this form forward and give Hamilton another trouncing. And I tell you, it's not going to take too long before those two are butting heads, which would be something I'd really like to see. Don't know about you guys. So anyway, those are my takeaways from it. If there's anything you think I've forgotten or any kind of counterpoints you guys like to make, please make them in the comments below. Other than that, we'll see you next time.